So, hi guys, welcome back to the History Buff. So you're here today with me, Artie, and a fellow history buff and familiar voice,
Anna Morris.
So she actually joined me on the episode that we did about Sissi, the Empress Elizabeth of Austria. And if you haven't checked that out, please do go and check it out. But today we are starting a series about the Tudors that we have called The Tudors, A Real Game of Thrones. And this is something that actually Morris knows something quite a bit about because you did it at uni, right?
Yeah, I'm definitely a Tudor buff. It's been a fascination of mine throughout all my history learnings. Focused on it, especially in my last year of uni, in kind of focus was overseas exploration, European diplomacy, and the rise of Tudor England. So I mean, it's something that's always really fascinating me because it's so much to unpack, and it was, it's the start of early modern history in England as we see it, like the close of the medieval times, and it was just scandalous, as we're going to unpack over the next few episodes.
I was actually inspired to make this series after doing the episode on Jane Grey, which I released a couple of weeks ago. So again, if you haven't checked that out, please do go and check it out. It's very interesting. She was also known as the 9 Days Queen. Yeah, the Tudors are by far Britain's most famous royal dynasty. They included consequential monarchs such as Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, and they are remembered for their drama, intrigue, treachery, and beheadings. Hence the name of the series.
That's putting it lightly.
Yes, putting it lightly. In this series, we're going to cover the Tudors from beginning to end, starting in this episode with how the Tudors managed to win the English crown. So, Henry VIII, I think, does overshadow the whole dynasty, but people forget that it was actually started by his father, Henry VII. He was Henry Tudor, but he would become the first Tudor monarch, which was Henry VII. So, I guess, first of all, what we need to do is give a bit of background to how the Tudors, to the time leading up to when the Tudors won the English crown. Yeah. So, Morris, do you want to start with that?
Absolutely. I think it's important to give Henry VII a little bit of airtime because, as we know, it's a big focus on the very scandalous, chaotic, and ever-changing reign of his son. But to kind of set the scene a little bit, you're looking at a large period of the 1400s. Now, the end of the Wars of the Roses, as it was called the Wars of the Roses because you had the House of Lancaster versus the House of York.
House of York being the white rose and House of Lancaster being the red rose.
Exactly. So we basically see a series of a domestic war that went on for...
Otherwise known as a civil war.
Otherwise known as a civil war. Historian over here. An in-house war.
Yes. They kept it very much in-house. They kept it in the family. Although the thing is that this is what also people forget, is that the House of Lancaster and House of York were two divisions of the House of Plantagenet.
Exactly. So, the rule of the Plantagenets, still the longest ruling dynasty in English history, 331 years.
Okay.
And it all starts with Edward III, who is arguably the most successful of English medieval kings. A huge amount of military success abroad, a lot of a kind of big rise in what we maybe see today as the first movements towards kind of modern bureaucracy. And he luckily or unluckily had 9 children. Now, it kind of starts with the fact that he had 5 sons. And what you see is a very successful king and long reigning king. For the time, he was on the throne for 50 years. Yeah, so he ruled from 1327 to 1377. And we are then left with 9 children, 5 sons, all highly competitive, highly ambitious, inspired by a father who had a very long and successful reign. So he also did a very good job of marrying off all his children to European royalty. So we have a very strong bloodlines throughout, throughout the family. And actually what we can see is that his sons...
so it all stems from this guy, Edward III. And so his two sons, first Duke of York, Edmund of Langley, as you said, the fourth surviving son of Edward II, and he had adopted the White Rose. And then the first Duke of Lancaster, John of Gaunt, the third surviving son of Edward III, who adopted the Red Rose. And that is where, obviously, you get the term the Wars of the Roses. Obviously, we're not going to go into too much detail about the Wars of the Roses because I have been watching so many documentaries on it, and it is just the amount of times that people are just like, so the Duke of Anjou married the Queen of
and then
the Duke of
mother,
blah, blah, blah.
sister, uncle, aunt gets involved.
It's
and
just too much.
It's so chaotic.
It's so chaotic.
And then as well, there's all the aristocracy in in England gets involved as well. Half of them are beheaded, the other half are exiled. Return to then behead and exile the other side. Would take
it would take us, I think, the whole series to actually just cover the War of Roses. So we're actually just going to give you the basics and then skip to the end when obviously
we bring in our main man, Edward Tudor.
Character.
Edward Tudor? Henry Tudor.
Henry Tudor, yes. So the reason why there is a succession crisis is because they've basically killed each other, and that's why there is. Because basically the man that we're going to talk about, Henry VII, Henry Tudor at that point, he actually has a pretty tenuous claim to the throne.
Very tenuous.
So we're going to go over that in just a sec. So basically, the Wars of the Roses began in 1455 and actually went on until 1487.
Yeah,
you had a guy on the throne called Henry VI. Okay, he was from the House of Lancaster. Now, it's important to remember that you didn't just have this war between the branches of the families trying to get their branch on the throne.
It's the whole court.
And you had other disagreements amongst the nobility. You had a weakened economy as well, and actually also disagreements over England's relationship with France. So basically you just had quite an unstable position, and it's just important to remember that the Wars of the Roses really was a very unstable period for England.
Pre-Wars of the Roses, there was something known as the 100 Years' War, and the constant battle between France and England. That's actually where Edward III gained a lot of his appreciation and position, was his successes in France, the very classic English enemy at the time. So England's already, its royal coffers are very much down from 100 years of war.
Yes.
And then you enter a civil war. So it's a period of real destruction, bearing in mind that the whole of the kind of 13th and 14th century as well, you've been absolutely destroyed by the Black Plague. It's really, the country is in tatters. Yeah,
it's in a real state. And so Henry VI, House of Lancaster, he is born in 1422 and ascended to the throne at just 1 year old. And a council actually ruled in his name until his 21st birthday. But of course, as what usually happens with regents, is that they wanted the power themselves.
It goes to their heads.
Yes, it goes to their heads. And so Henry VI married the niece of the King of France, Margaret of Anjou, and this pissed off the barons who wanted to continue waging war with France. Okay, and it's also important to remember that Henry VI he was prone to periods of mental instability.
Yeah,
and that obviously affected his governance.
Absolutely. He kind of gave way to these very ambitious individuals acting in his name, acting as regent to seize power and to, rally troops and act in their own interest. And actually, this is very evident over the next few years when you see young kings step onto the throne, because the problem with the Wars of the Roses is as soon as someone was on the throne, they would be contested, and they would probably die,
Yes.
and then as soon as the king dies, it goes to their children. Now, the life expectancy in the Tudor times wasn't that high anyway, so you kind of had a lot of infants being natural heirs to the throne, which gave way for protectors or regents to take over, act in their name.
Yeah.
So hugely unstable.
Hugely unstable.
And in the meantime, there's no money. The country is suffering. It's just horrendous.
Yeah. So the Wars of the Roses started on Henry VI's watch. Now, with the Battle of Towton in 1461, the Yorks crushed the Lancastrians in the bloodiest conflict on English soil. 20,000 people were killed, and they then installed Edward IV as a Yorkist king, and he ruled until 1470. Basically, now I guess that gives you a little bit of context of the Wars of the Roses. We're now going to talk about the central character. Do you have anything else to add?
No, I think we should wind forward to kind of pre Henry VII, what the situation was with Richard III, the last Yorkist king. And so they say the worst ruler in history.
Yeah. What, Richard III?
Yeah.
Well, for reasons which will soon become apparent.
No publicity is bad publicity.
Yeah, exactly. Wait, you mean all publicity is good publicity?
Well, yeah, same thing. That really confused me for a second. Yeah, basically.
Love that.
Would you rather be a forgotten king like Edward, like
To
Henry,
be fair, that's true.
like Edward IV, or
That
do you
is
want to be
true.
the world's worst king?
That's very true.
Richard III.
Exactly.
Who was riddled with evil.
Also, like Jane Grey, she only ruled for 9 days, but I guess she's famous for...
Your podcast.
Yeah, exactly. Pretty much. To be fair, I actually thought she was famous, and actually she's not that famous. Not a lot of people know about her.
Morris, do you want to do an episode on Jane Grey? I was like, no.
And she was like, nah, she's kind of boring. Yeah. Well, I find her interesting. So, but anyway, Henry Tudor, the main character of this part of our story. So he was born at Pembroke Castle in Western Wales.
Welsh bloke.
Welsh, exactly. On the 28th of January, 1457. That's something that not a lot of people know, is that the Tudors were actually Welsh.
Yep.
And actually, I think Tudor is the English spelling of a Welsh. Well, Tudor is a Welsh name, basically.
10 points if you can pronounce it in Welsh.
Yeah, exactly. Which I can't. I'm not going to try and butcher it myself. No, I'm not going to bother. So he was son of the first Earl of Richmond, Edmund Tudor, who was half brother to the reigning Plantagenet king at that time, which was Henry VI. So
very tenuous link. This
very
is
tenuous link, and that's the thing.
His actual, I think his most legitimate claim was actually through his mother.
Who was called Margaret Beaufort.
Margaret Beaufort, who had a much stronger lineage. Edmund Tudor actually was...
his father was Owen Tudor, who was an ambitious Welsh commoner and actually the son of an outlaw, but who had actually managed to become a servant at court and eventually married, though, Catherine de Valois, who had actually been Queen of England, but only for 2 years. So their marriage hadn't been official, so Owen Tudor and Catherine de Valois, but they had 5 children, including Edmund. Okay, so Edmund being Henry Tudor's father. So, but as we said, Henry's mother was Margaret Beaufort, who was a descendant of John of Gaunt.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so related to...
So the son of Edward III.
Yes, and obviously so linked to the House of Lancaster. Mm-hmm. So his father died of the bubonic plague just 3 months before he was born. So Margaret, his mother, was left 6 months pregnant at just 13 years old. Yeah. She struggled through, but managed to birth Henry. So his mother was very ambitious, and apparently at his christening, ordered her son to be rechristened Henry from the more Welsh-sounding Owen, demonstrating her hope Henry might one day become King of England. So from a very early time, she harbored hopes that her son might be able to one day assume the throne. And
she actually sent him very early on to support Henry VI, spend a lot of time with Henry VI, who was his uncle. This is where he, got a lot of, I suppose, kingly training as such, but also very much the Lancastrian cause was embedded into him.
Yeah, Margaret had to be married again, and so she left Henry in the care of his uncle Jasper at Pembroke Castle while she remarried. So yeah, Henry's early life was dominated by the Wars of the Roses, and Jasper was actually forced to flee to France after the accession of Edward IV, and Edward IV assigned him a Yorkist guardian, and that was William Herbert.
Yeah,
and so kept him at Pembroke Castle.
He was essentially locked up for
pretty much
for several years because he couldn't go anywhere.
Yeah. But then in 1471, he was forced to flee to Brittany after the Lancastrian defeat in the Wars of the Roses, and he sought refuge at the court of Francis II, the Duke of Brittany, who provided him actually with a lot of protection from Yorkist forces.
I think as well that explains his very sensible foreign policy later, because he really benefited from the protection of the French king, and he spent time in France, which he compared to a lot of monarchs at that time. He didn't exert himself internationally. He definitely had a more humble policy and sought peace with the French, something which previously hadn't caused, we said how peace with France made the Duke really unpopular. But yeah, so he is definitely, he kind of stays away, rallies the troops, comes up with a game plan.
And he formed alliances with disaffected Yorkists.
Exactly.
He lived in exile for over a decade, during which, as you said, he is gathering support and he plots his return to England and, forms alliances with disaffected Yorkists, French supporters, including Margaret of Anjou, widow of Henry VI, and Charles VIII of France. So he also engaged in diplomatic efforts to secure military assistance and financial backings for his claim to the English throne. Now, when he was in exile, he actually lived quite a modest life. He relied on the generosity of his hosts and supporters.
He was really, really smart in that sense. I think when he was being taken to France, before he's taken to France, he was waiting on a message from a French viscount, and then the messenger hadn't arrived yet, so he feigned stomach cramps to miss the tides, so that he could wait for this viscount to deliver, or the messenger to deliver the viscount's approval that Henry can come and stay with him, and that he has support. So therefore, he kind of kept himself safe, and found sanctuary, with various different people, which was probably a lot smarter than going head on, like a lot of the other monarchs who didn't make it through. So we already see here his high intelligence. Yeah. So Henry VII in exile, not much he can do at the moment in terms of, seizing the crown. He has to plot, he has to plan. But in this period in 1483, you have Margaret Beaufort, Henry VII's mother, who is very actively promoting him in England as an alternative to the very evil Richard III. So although she was married to a Yorkist, I think Lord Stanley, she, was doing a lot of PR, and coming from her with her strong claim to the throne, I think this really, really helped, to be honest, because it wasn't a huge shock when, people had heard of him. Let's just say he wasn't a randomer. And this was also the connection where Margaret Beaufort essentially said, my son, Henry VII, will marry Elizabeth of York. So that was actually prearranged. So you kind of see progress being made in terms of them linking themselves to Yorkists, which would definitely later help against enemies and fundamentally ending the Wars of the Roses to bring us into, the early modern period. But before then, we just mentioned Richard III, the last Yorkist king, highly, highly unpopular. And he was, from the get-go, it was a very shady reign.
asshole.
It was a very shady reign.
Yeah.
Because he was actually employed as Lord Protector to Edward V. So Edward V was a very young king. I think he was about 13 years old.
Yeah.
And then you have someone who's Richard III, or the Duke of Gloucester, who he was at the time, the Lord Protector.
He became the Lord Protector. So because obviously Edward V was so young, he couldn't rule. So the Lord Protector was someone who was appointed to basically rule on his behalf.
And guide.
Yes,
and
guide him.
Develop. But he definitely did the absolute opposite.
Absolute opposite, because Edward V was never crowned. So he and his brother Richard were locked in the Tower of London by Richard.
And they just disappear. And there were bodies found, but not confirmed to be theirs.
Yes.
They were presumed dead after a while, but there was no kind of evidence that they were. There was a lack of, contemporary accounts, because the room they were kept in was so heavily guarded that no one saw them. And it was just a bizarre situation that even to this day hasn't really been solved. I mean, obviously he killed them, but there were, I think there have been like DNA testings and stuff.
Yeah, and it's and what's crazy is that he was their uncle.
Yeah.
So he was their uncle, and the thing is, Richard seized power as Lord Protector, alleging that actually Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid. So that actually made Edward V illegitimate. Okay, and because of that, Richard, who, as we said, was the Duke of Gloucester, and the uncle and Lord Protector of the boy king, he actually was petitioned to become king, and he was crowned on the 6th of July, 1583. But as we said, it was amongst all the suspicion and controversy with the disappearance of his nephews.
It's actually crazy, isn't it? He just declares this marriage invalid, and then kind of kidnaps these two kids and locks them away.
These
and they were never
kids.
seen again.
Yeah, Edward and Richard.
Really
and by the way, every male in this period is called either Richard, Edward, or Henry.
Yeah, it's nuts.
Yeah, literally, those are the three names at this time.
I guess names come in and out of fashion, but
and then women: Elizabeth, Mary, and maybe Margaret.
Elizabeth, Mary, Margaret,
and
maybe Anne,
and then
1400 Anne.
Yes. So there were three names.
So if you're
for
writing
each
an
genders.
essay, put any of them in, because you've got a 33%
you're bound to be right.
chance
Exactly.
that it's the chances are you'll probably get it right.
Yes, exactly.
You just swap them out of it.
A pretty seedy start to his reign, and the thing is, it put off a lot of Yorkists, didn't it? And Richard was,
a Yorkist himself.
A Yorkist himself.
So you had two massive rebellions, even in his, very, very short reign, because he was only on the throne for 2 years. But even in that time, rebellions against him.
And do you think most of that came from the fact that he murdered his? I think a lot of it did.
I personally don't think it did. I don't think in those days it was probably seen as scandalous.
Murdering your nephews?
Because he didn't technically murder them. They were just never seen again.
That's it. They're never seen again.
They were never seen again. And he was very much kind of promoting this idea that actually the claim of Edward V was illegitimate. And therefore he was I think he was hoping to kind of brush past it, this kid is illegitimate, he's out of the way. Obviously he never admitted to killing him. I think he was trying to dissolve, just let them be part of history, essentially.
Right, okay. So they fade into history.
Exactly.
So but I think it did still cause a bit of division.
I mean, definitely, because he declared himself the rightful king, but at this point people were there was a rightful king 2 minutes ago, and before that there was a rightful king.
Yes, exactly. So it's just a continuation of the chaos.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's just, it's insane. But there was a lot of unrest in that time. I think the economic situation at this point was horrendous.
Yeah.
And
so, and I think this is all what helps to get some disaffected Yorkists to start turning towards Henry Tudor.
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely I think they were probably just done. I know that Richard,
they were just over it. They were fully over it.
Yeah, for sure. Everyone's either just dying, or I mean, this is also in those times the printing press had not yet been released, so how much of this was made public, in the sense that the vast majority of the English population will have no idea what's going on.
They didn't have OK magazine back then?
No, they didn't originally. They had a pamphlet. OK pamphlet.
The OK pamphlet.
The OK Gazette. Like inked with a quill.
So on Christmas Day 1483, Henry, so he's still in exile at this point, and he actually pledged in Rennes to defeat Richard III and to marry, crucially, Elizabeth of York, who is obviously a Yorkist, and this actually is in order to sort of placate the restless Yorkists who are turning towards him. So it's basically to try and get their support. So he promised this on Christmas Day 1483, and Richard III actually wanted to stop this, so he actually was going to marry Elizabeth of York, despite the fact that she was his niece.
Just to add another layer of chaos just general
craziness. And just...
It's like, as if it wasn't bad enough someone's coming for your throne, you're also going to make it even more chaotic by going after the same woman.
It does sound like HBO Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
Like, this is really the real Game of Thrones.
Yeah, it's nuts.
So Henry Tudor finally, gets a small army together.
Funded heavily by France as well.
Funded heavily by France, and they set sail on the 1st of August, and they landed at Milford Haven in Wales on the 7th of August, 1485. He was basically accompanied by a small force of French and Breton mercenaries. Now, he chose Wales, I think, because it was obviously symbolically very important to sort of capitalize on his Welsh heritage. He knew that if he, marched through Wales, he would probably get a lot of support because he was Welsh.
Yeah.
So he aimed to rally support from local nobles and troops loyal to the Lancastrian cause. Now, when he landed at Milford Haven, he was reportedly very emotional, because don't forget, he'd been exiled for 14 years by this point. Basically half of his life. Landed at Milford Haven, he came ashore, and he fell to his knees, kissed the soil, and said in Latin, "Judge and revenge my cause, O Lord." He was very, very emotional to be back in his homeland.
Yeah. Have to remember that Richard's army was
a lot bigger.
3 times bigger.
Yeah, he manages to get, I think, after his march through Wales, he has 5,000 men, I think. As in Henry
does. And then Richard's is obviously, he's the king at the time, he has 3 times more. But he's actually split up his army into 3 subsections, and Henry kept his. But one of them, I can't remember which, I think the Duke of Norfolk didn't, when Richard III said attack, Duke of Norfolk
William
didn't
Stanley.
do it. Yeah, he was so that there we go. Oh, there you go. William Stanley, son of Lord Stanley, married to Margaret Beaufort, Henry VII's mother.
Yeah.
So we see that everyone is done with battle. Everyone is done with Richard III, and now you see the Yorkists and the Lancastrians almost working together in like small sections, because otherwise Henry Tudor probably wouldn't have won, if he's being attacked from all sides. But luckily his mother's link to the Yorkists and his promise of marriage to Elizabeth of York actually turned Yorkist supporters swung in favour towards him rather than their Yorkist king Richard, who, this just goes to show again how awful he was as a person. He had a lot of people beheaded. He locked his nephews in the Tower. He had a terrible policy with pretty much everything, and is therefore known as worst king ever. So big up Henry the Sixth.
So
Seventh.
Henry the Seventh. See, this is just because there's so many kings and and so many nobles, so many Henrys, so many Richards, so many Edwards, and it's a lot. Okay. So Henry marches through Wales. So on the 22nd of August, he arrives near Market Bosworth in Leicestershire. And this is where you have the kind of climactic battle of the Wars of the Roses, the Battle of Bosworth Field.
Yeah.
So this is where he meets Richard's army, which, as we said, was 3 times larger than his, about 15,000 men. Now, Richard actually crowned himself symbolically again before the battle.
Massive PR stunt.
Yeah, exactly. and also a really good way to sort of, single yourself out to the enemy.
Yeah.
Like, he was obviously not meant to be king if he made that mistake.
Good riddance.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I think he was very slight as a person, Richard III. So I think he just had to do all this, like, surrounding stuff, put on loads of pells and glamour and whatever to try and reclaim himself.
Serve kingly diva realness.
Exactly.
Diva realness. You had Henry having a smaller army, but these nobles, Thomas and William Stanley, who had said that they weren't going to support anyone until they could see essentially where the wind was blowing. So they decided to not get involved until they could tell who was going to win.
Shady,
because obviously,
smart.
well, yeah, because they wanted to be
definitely have done that.
Exactly. They wanted to make sure that they were on the winning side, so that they wouldn't, lose your head in case they were on the wrong side. Henry obviously had significant support from Wales. So actually, a lot of his army was Welsh commoners. A substantial portion of his army was also French forces as well. So the battle began with initial skirmishes between the sort of vanguard forces on both sides. And Henry's forces, even though they were outnumbered, they were actually pretty effective.
Yeah, they were. I think the French mercenaries did a really good job.
Yeah.
And obviously Stanley backing out, supporting the king. And he actually also... so Henry actually didn't have any military experience. That is something which is relevant later when we talk about his rule. But Henry VII did not actually have fighting experience. So he hired, I guess, or got the Duke of Oxford, a very experienced military man, to lead his army. Very unkingly not to have military experience and not to be a fighter. But Henry VII, this wasn't his pride as such stepping in. He hired an excellent militant to lead and, consequently win with his army.
And he had also picked up key Welsh supporters, such as someone called Rhys ap Thomas, who was a prominent Welsh noble, and he actually had pledged significant military support. So he had very.
It was a mixed bunch.
It was a mixed bunch, but obviously one that that functioned very well together.
Yeah.
And it was determined and very well led. The climax of the battle happened when Richard III saw an opportunity to strike directly at Henry. He saw Henry across the field and led a cavalry charge aimed at killing him and ending the battle swiftly. And this is obviously when you have Stanley's intervention, because, as we said, Stanley said he wasn't going to get involved until he could see which way the battle was going. So at the critical moment, the forces of Thomas Stanley and his brother William Stanley, they'd been watching from a distance. They decided to intervene, and their troops attacked Richard's flank, and this turned the favour of the war in Henry's favour. So Richard was actually knocked off his horse, but he got up and still continued to fight, according to a lot of witnesses, like a lion. And he was really, really going for it. But obviously, this didn't last because, he was pretty much surrounded. And he was killed by being impaled by an unknown Welsh pikeman and then beaten to death. And so, his death obviously marked the sort of decisive moment of the battle, which led to the collapse of the Yorkist resistance. Because also that's the thing, the Yorkists had a bigger army, but a lot of them were not trained. A lot of them didn't like Richard. And a lot of them, especially I think when you had the Stanley intervention, a lot of them fled. Yes, a lot of them fled. So Richard is dead. And Henry claims victory, and Richard's crown, his bloodied crown, is found underneath a bush in Bosworth Field, and the crown is then symbolically placed on Henry's head.
Good. So, Henry VII has successfully taken the throne.
He's won the throne.
Won the throne. This is 1485. This marks the last battle in the War of the Roses. It marks the end of the Plantagenet dynasty, and it marks the end of the medieval era in English history. And we now, with the coronation, we now see the start of the early modern era, out of the Dark Ages, out of the Middle Ages, into modern history.
Yes, exactly. So, the Tudors have won the English crown. And he was crowned on the 30th of October 1485 at Westminster Abbey in London in a very expensive and glittering ceremony, which is very un-Henry VII, which we will talk about in the next episode. So he then very soon afterwards married Elizabeth of York, as he said he was going to.
Uniting the roses.
Uniting the two houses, Lancaster and York. And this obviously ended the Wars of the Roses. And once married, this merged the houses. And so this obviously, it actually happened in a visual sense, because it merged the white rose of York was superimposed onto the red rose of Lancaster. Exactly. And that's how you got the Tudor rose. Which
is actually quite bizarre, given they're all from the same family in the first place.
Yes, exactly. I know. The
family's made up.
Yeah, exactly.
Essentially.
So, but it's important to remember, becoming king was just the beginning.
Yeah.
Okay. So it was only now he basically actually done the easy bit, essentially winning the crown.
It's incredible that was the easy bit.
I know, exactly. So he had to bring an exhausted, war-ravaged country together, and ensure that his dynasty would outlast him, because it had been over 100 years since a king had come to the throne unchallenged. Yeah. So
that brings us to episode 2 next time. Plenty to unpack.
Yeah, and
after a very chaotic explanation of chaotic times,
and a rather chaotic episode in which we discussed this chaotic times.
Yeah, I mean, it had to fit like. We had to set the scene.
Yes, we had to set the scene, and the fact that we were struggling so much encapsulates how chaotic it was.
Absolutely. Edward VI. I mean, Edward IV.
Just as a little sneak peek, so Henry had to suppress no less than 4 rebellions in the 12 years after he became king. And would eventually, and he would go on to rule for 24 years. So, that's what we'll be covering in the next episode. So, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think it's going to be a really exciting series, I have to say. Now that we've kind of got everyone out of the way, we can focus solely on the Tudors.
Exactly.
And
our sexiest royal dynasty.
Sexiest royal dynasty.
Well, guys, thank you so much for joining us today, talking about how the Tudors won the English crown.
Yep.
Please like and subscribe. Give us a follow on social media. Rate us on your podcast streaming service. But otherwise, see you next time.
Woo, see you next time.
Bye.